I saw him sitting back there, and I just...
Mr. Sheriff, and Westerners, guests, Guy Logston asked me to introduce the speaker tonight, and I'm very glad to do it. My remarks will be limited because I've never believed making an introduction carried with it the privilege of making a speech. Bat Shunatoma has been my close friend and neighbor for many years. I threatened him a little yesterday about the disclosures I expected to make. He lit on his feet, as he nearly always does, and he told me that I expect to hear nothing but the truth. So I'll have to let him up a little bit easy. I'm not going to tell you the things I could tell you about him. I could talk a long time and say very good things about him and say nothing but the truth. But I've decided the thing to do is let him make his own case. And so I present to you the wild Otoe, Bat Shunatoma.
Thank you, Brother Davis. Great. You know, the more I see of Earl, the more I'm able to understand the meaning of the phrase, exemplary conduct as becomes a cadet, a gentleman, and a scholar. Thank you. It's real nice to be here. And nice to see you people, and I know that you're qualified because I can see that your ears are open and your eyes are bloodshot. Now, gentlemen of the jury, I was asked, of course, to do a number of things tonight to try to entertain you, or as I remarked to Brother Guy Logston, to attempt to give you a lesson in adversity. First, though, someone suggested that I should name some of the Indian athletes in the state of Oklahoma. And, Sheriff, you don't need to worry. They're not here. First, I would have to start with, in football, the one and only Jim Thorpe. As you all know, King Gustav of Sweden declared him to be the finest athlete in the world. That's enough for Jim Thorpe, because you can't do any better. Then I can mention a number of people that I'm sure that you would recognize, like, for instance, Tom Stidham and Tiny Roebuck, both Choctaw Indians who played on the famous Haskell Indian team. And in my estimation, Tom Stidham and Tiny Roebuck are the two greatest tackles that ever played on any one team. Then I would say John Levi and his brother George Levy from over in the Arapaho and Cheyenne country, who were great in the backfield. They played at Haskell Indian Institute, and also John Levi played at Phillips. Mays McClain from Pryor played on the Haskell Indian team and was one of the greatest fullbacks in the country. He later matriculated at Iowa University and went on to gain fame there in the Big Ten. Rabbit Weller from Anadarko played with Haskell and was one of the greatest scatbacks that a person would ever want to see. He was a little fella, but he could do it. Then, of course, a lot of you people from A&M or Tulsa or other places would recognize the great Creek Indian, Jack Jacobs, who played at the University of Oklahoma. I would go on then to another Indian, a Choctaw Indian from Atoka, Bob Sumpter. He played at Haskell Indian Institute for about 3 years, and then in the fall of 1924, matriculated at the University of Oklahoma as a freshman. And he played on the same freshman team that I was fortunate enough to quarterback. And I might stop right there and say that that freshman team at the University of Oklahoma in 1924 was the team that concluded the annual fall series of the Boomer and Sooner game. They used to have a regular game. But in that fall of 24, on one Saturday, Oklahoma University was able to beat Nebraska University. And you know, that wasn't done very often in those days. And on the next Saturday, the freshman team at the University of Oklahoma beat the Sooners. And that concluded the Boomer Sooner game. Of course, there was a reason for that. Oklahoma University had a good team. But just as an afterthought, I might mention that this freshman team was composed of, in the backfield, Ray LeCrone, who had played at Tulsa University with me for 2 years. And then the halfback was Frank Potts, who had played at East Central at Ada for about 4 or 5 years. And I had played at Tulsa University for 2 years, was the quarterback. And the other halfback was a young man from Shawnee, whose name eludes me right now, but he was the finest of all of the backfield members of that team. Unfortunately,
Mooney?
No, it wasn't Mooney. It was before Mooney. But unfortunately, that young man was killed in an automobile accident in California the next summer. Then,
That one will bring on the NCAA.
I'll stand on the Fifth Amendment. But on that team, we had a number of people, like I mentioned the name of Bob Sumpter. We had a young man that you people recognize as General Hal Muldrow, and we had Ray LeCrone's brother, Roy LeCrone, on one end, and a fine gentleman who later was here in Oklahoma City as a fine lawyer, Mort Brown. So that we did have a fairly decent freshman team. Now, in basketball, I would mention one man who was a standout as far as Indians are concerned in the game of basketball in the state of Oklahoma. And that one man, a lot of you will recognize. His name is Cab Rennick. He played at an institution up here in Payne County and was great. I mean, an all-American player there under Hank Iba, and then later played at Phillips 66 in one of their great AAU teams. Another gentleman named Elmer Behale, who was a cousin of mine, played with me on the Tulsa University team and was one of the greatest dribblers that I've ever seen. Then there's Wayne Eshelman, a Pawnee Indian boy that I played with in high school, who later played at Central. Not very many basketball players of note. In baseball, of course, we would have to start with none other than the Super Chief, Allie Reynolds. Played, of course, at Stillwater in the same school there in Payne County, and then became famous as the Super Chief of the New York Yankees. Ben Tincup. A lot of you people are too young to remember that name. He played with the Philadelphia Phillies. And Moses Yellowhorse, who was a Pawnee Indian boy. I had played with him in semi-pro ball. And we went on a trip into Arkansas with an Indian team from Pawnee. We played there 3 days. We'd play baseball in the daytime, and we would hold an Indian dance at nighttime. And on that trip through Arkansas, he was found, in other words, and signed with the Arkansas Travelers in the Southern League. And the next year, he played with the Pittsburgh Pirates. He could have been one of the greatest of baseball pitchers. But as you know, a lot of we Indian people have a problem with old John Barleycorn, and that prevented him from being an immortal. A man named Bill Wayno from over around Shawnee was a great baseball player. Played first base and played in the lesser leagues, but was always a fine player. And I know I played with him a number of times, and he was always one of the men to watch. A man named Wallace Murray, a Pawnee Indian, played first base in the semi-pro leagues, and back in those days when we were young and we were playing, every team in the country had a baseball team. This man, Wallace Murray, in my estimation again, was the finest glove man that I have ever seen. Played first base. Joe Mays, a young Cherokee boy from Pryor, played on the University of Oklahoma team and then played in the minor leagues, and was a wonderful man and a wonderful catcher. Joe Adair, from over around Pryor, a Cherokee Indian boy, played in the lesser leagues and played in the semi-pro ball and played in the Tulsa oil leagues like I did when I was younger. And then another man that we all remember from down in the Anadarko country, Moses Poolaw. He never did get into the big leagues, but he played in semi-pro and in the lesser leagues and was another one of the fine Indian athletes. I was asked to name a few of the Indian athletes, and these I could do without any problem. But I knew that there was one element that we did not have any reason to neglect. And this gets into the sport of boxing. I'm sure that you all remember that in those days, in the 30s and the 40s, Oklahoma was famous for the Golden Gloves tournament and for their Golden Gloves champions. I knew a number of those boys, and I remembered some of their names, but I also knew where to go to find about all of these people who were champions and who boxed in the Golden Gloves. So I contacted my friend Bill Thorpe. He was a Golden Gloves man in his day. And of course, he promptly gave me the information that I wanted to know. And although he gave me a list, I'm not going to name them all. I'm just going to pick out a few of them because I'm sure you will remember. His list, of course, included only 80 Indian boxers in the Golden Gloves tournaments. And he was telling me tonight that he missed 2 or 3, he was sure of. But some of those names you will recall. Junior Munsell, Marvin Liddell, great names in the area of Golden Gloves champions. Benny McIntosh, Tyrus Tarzan Smith, and Tommy Hand, the Pawnee boy who was one of the real small boxers but was a champion. Francis Shoulderblade, a heavyweight. Sequoia Downing, Cherokee. Ray and Alvin Williams from around Tulsa. Billy and Amos Tiger from Tulsa. Asa Howling Wolf. Bruce Williams. Luke Tainpaw. Bruce Toma. These are names that were foremost in the world of the Golden Gloves, and many of these were national champions. And every year, when boxing was part of the curriculum, you might say, of the Indian schools in the state of Oklahoma, they sponsored boxing. And to our shame, and to the government's shame, for some reason, boxing was abandoned in the Indian trained in schools in the state of Oklahoma. Now, so much for that. I have named those as I was requested to do. First, now, let me say one thing. If my wife happens to peek in the door, these are the results of my research and my notes and my speech. She admonished me the other day, you should study and prepare yourself. You should do some research. And you should make your notes. And you should write a speech. She said, the people that you're going to talk to are intelligent people. And she said, even if you can't be intelligent, you should act like you are intelligent. Some of you know, of course, that my wife is a Creek Indian, which makes her one of the 5 civilized tribes. But sometimes I think she overdoes that word civilized. So here I am. I'm prepared. Let me say now, from here on out, the rest of the evening, which will be 2 or 3 hours long, I would have to entitle the rest as the personal pronoun I. I say that because what I say now will be either the result of my participation as a player or as an official in whatever game it might happen to be. I could say that in football, I was very fortunate. As a player, I had never played football in high school. I went to preparatory school in southern Pennsylvania for 3 years and came back because my father was in bad health and went to Pawnee High School, which was my home, and was there for my senior year. I played basketball and baseball there, but they had eliminated football because some young man had been killed in one of the games, and football had not been reinstated. So I matriculated then at the University of Tulsa. Of course, I was very fortunate there because I got a job sweeping the gym and cleaning the swimming pool, and played basketball and football and baseball there for 2 years prior to entering the University of Oklahoma to go into the law school. But at Tulsa, I went out for the football team just because if it was athletics, I was interested. I played on the third team the first week, played on the second team the second week, and then was able to play on the first team. In 1922, we didn't lose a game. We beat TCU, we beat Texas A&M in the Cotton Bowl, and we beat Arkansas University at Fayetteville. And the game at Fayetteville, I particularly remember because one thing, I played halfback on offense and played end on defense. But the thing I remember about that game is that the score was 13-7 in favor of Tulsa. And the 7 points on the part of Arkansas University was scored by a man who is a senator from Arkansas, Bill Fulbright. Now, we were scheduled to play a team at Stillwater on November the 11th, but we didn't get to play them. They decided that we had an ineligible player and they wouldn't play us. But I think they knew what we had accomplished during the course of the season, and that armistice game was canceled. We did play Southwestern College of Weatherford, and that was in the days of Jink Simmons. We were able to beat them, but it was a task. And then on Thanksgiving Day, we played a team from Edmond, Central State. and we were able to beat them, but that was the greatest team that we played in that whole year. They had a fine football team, and we were lucky, of course, to be able to prevail against them. I mentioned that just as football. In baseball, I played on the University of Oklahoma teams for 2 years after I became eligible from that freshman year. I had played at Tulsa 2 years, and I had played in semi-pro ball and in the town teams and on the Indian teams. And at the University of Oklahoma, both years, we were able to win the conference championship. I particularly recall 2 games of that series of games. We went to the University of Kansas to play a 2-game series. And in the game, some way, somehow, I was able to hit a triple to bring in 2 scores and beat Kansas University in the deciding game. And our old friend Paul Gallen came into the dressing room after the game was over, and we were changing clothes, and he was so incensed. He looked around, and he pointed his finger at me, and he said, "You ain't no amateur." I didn't reply. Sometime I might tell Paul Gallen that you didn't know it, but you were so right. And the other game I remember was up at Stillwater. We went up to A&M to play there. And at that time, the baseball field was just north of the old Gallagher, not the old gymnasium. And the baseball field faced to the south and to the east. On that particular day, there was a very, very strong or high north wind. T-Bone McDonald, a lot of you people remember that name. He was the center fielder for A&M. Some way, somehow, I was able to knock 3 home runs with that north wind. And in those days, we didn't have stadiums, we didn't have fences, and poor old T-Bone retrieved the ball 3 times, and you know, to this day, every time I see T-Bone, he starts cussing me with his tongue hanging out. But another funny part about that game, I mentioned Moses Yellowhorse as a great pitcher. His half-brother, Ben Gover, a Pawnee Indian, was one of the greatest umpires that I have ever seen. The same story. Had he not been afflicted with the problem of John Barleycorn, he should have been one of the great professional league umpires. But he worked that football game. And when I would come to bat, he would say, "Never," or "It's a towel," or some other Indian word to me. And I'd promptly hit a home run. Well, before the game was over with, I turned to the catcher, and I believe his name was Rogers. And I said, "You don't know it, but I've got it made. The chief back there tells me what's coming, so it's easy." Now, to go on, I decided that it would be well to tell you people about some of the trials and tribulations as far as being an official is concerned, to work the games of football or basketball. First, I can start with football and tell you some of the things that happened. For instance, in the Tulsa, Arkansas game, which we played in Fayetteville, I recalled, of course, to you that the touchdown for Arkansas was scored by Senator Bill Fulbright. It was quite a game because the coach from Arkansas was named Francis Smith, and he had been the coach at Tulsa University the previous year. and I played basketball under him, and then he transferred to Arkansas, but he had established the contract with Arkansas, and here we go then playing old coach. So it was quite a game and quite a thrill because it was a hard-fought game. And, of course, the same problem of eligibility came up there, but we played the game anyway. But Coach Francis Smith was a wonderful player. He left Arkansas, went to TCU, and then to Ohio State University. I remember a game, Missouri played at Wisconsin University in 1942. The officials are required, of course, to hold what they call a pregame conference. So we get together while we're dressing. And at this time, while we were dressing, I looked down and I saw a shoestring on my football shoe was broken. About that time, a young man came up by me, and he said, "Chief," he said, "you in trouble?" I said, "I certainly am. I just noticed I had a broken shoelace here." He turned, and in a couple of minutes was back with a new shoestring. And I put that in the shoe then, and we got dressed. And lo and behold, he introduced himself to me, and the man's name was Harry Studerer. He was the football coach and the athletic director of Wisconsin University. And, of course, you all remember him as the quarterback for the Four Horsemen of Notre Dame. And I thought he was a busboy. Then, again, I'll say that one of the great games that I remember particularly happened right here in Oklahoma City. Texas Christian University played a game out here at Taft Stadium against Oklahoma A&M. Bob Fenimore was in that game. Dutch Meyer was the Texas Christian University coach. So, at the end of the first half, we knew that there were just 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 seconds to play. In those days, we didn't have the big clocks where everybody can watch. So the time was kept either by the field judge or by a timer on the sidelines. In this game, my old friend Otis Wilde was the designated timekeeper. And knowing that the first half was about to end, of course, we watched, and I saw the ball was snapped. I was the referee, and Oklahoma A&M was on the offense. So the ball came back to Fenimore, and he made a sachet to the right, and then stopped and threw a forward pass to a teammate down the field. But it was intercepted, and the Texas Christian University man ran for a touchdown. And, of course, we knew the first half was over because the gun went off while he was running for the touchdown. So, even though the half is over, you have to conclude by the extra point. We went down there to the south end of the field and got ready for the try for point, and about that time, here comes Otis Wilde across the field. And he said, "Bat, I'm sorry, but the time had expired before the ball was snapped." And he said, "We couldn't get the gun to shoot until later on." Well, you know, the timekeeper is just as much an official as the referee, umpire, head linesman, field judge, or who. And so, if he says time had expired before this ball had been snapped, that is it. I explained to the captain, and then, as you might say, all hell broke loose. The assistant coach, Hub McQuillan, came running over to me, and Dutch Myers was in the press box. He didn't get there at the moment, but pretty soon Dutch Myers got there. And we talked, and I just told him that there wasn't any need to be arguing because regardless of who the timekeeper happened to be, his word was official, and I was very sorry about it, but there was nothing could be done. And so the game ended. Oklahoma A&M beat them by about 8 or 10 points. But nevertheless, that was quite a controversy and actually something to behold. But I was very pleased about that game because when the game was over with, two young men came by where the officials, we were going to go back down to the Skirvin Hotel and change clothes, and one of those men happened to be a fellow named Bud Wilkinson. And he said, Bat, I thought you would be interested in knowing. We were sitting in the press box, and we were watching the proceedings, and we saw Otis Weil raise that gun and try to shoot it before the ball was snapped. And that was a great relief to me, because those things can happen, and it's a matter of two sides. And sometimes, of course, you may be on the wrong side, but when things do happen and the regulations are there, actually, why, there isn't any Supreme Court. I worked a game that Missouri played at Ohio State. You remember the Missouri teams? In that game there, why, that is one of the two times that I feel like an official deliberately called a play wrong. And it was against Missouri, unfortunately. I feel like an official deliberately called a play wrong. And it was against Missouri, unfortunately. Very close game. But again, the officials, of course, have a pregame conference. We were in the room in the hotel and having a conference and changing clothes. And one of the other officials from the Big Ten League looked at me, and he looked at me, and he said, man, he said, you sure do have a tan. He said, how can you get something like that? And I said, well, in the summertime down in Oklahoma, I just go play golf in my walking shorts, and you can tell, look at me, I'm brown as an Indian. And I never did tell him any better. And along the same line, I worked a game between Missouri and Minnesota at Minneapolis. And along that same line, a lawyer from Columbus was one of the Big Ten officials. And we were changing clothes in the locker room, having our regular pregame conference. And this lawyer looked at me, and he looked at me, and he just couldn't contain himself. Finally, he said, man, he said, you sure do stay out in the sun a lot, don't you? And I said, I surely do. And about that time, John Waldorf, who is my good friend and is presently the commissioner of athletics in the Big 8 League, we worked many a game together, and with our wives would always have a fine trip and a fine visit wherever we went. John couldn't contain himself, and he started chuckling, finally burst out laughing. He said, hell, man, don't you know you're talking to a full-blood Oklahoma Indian? So a lot of things happen that are comical at times, but these are interesting things, and you can remember back when you were involved in certain angles of athletics and glory in the fact that you are certain that being there makes you be in good physical condition and gives you strength of mind and health of body. refereed a game in 1947 at Duke University. And I think, Heine, you remember Don Farrow. He was the coach of Missouri University, and they were in their heyday with the split tee. I went down to Durham, and at that time, Wallace Wade was the coach at Duke, and the Eastern papers thought that Duke had a very fine football team. But, you know, they spent all afternoon trying to find the ball, and Missouri just beat them to death. And I remember, of course, what a fine gentleman Wallace Wade was. And then, after the game, went to the airport and flew back to Washington. And my friend Bill Jennings, who was one of the assistant coaches at the University of Oklahoma, was there to scout the game because OU was going to play Missouri the next week. So on the plane back to Washington, where we changed and took a plane into Oklahoma City, Bill was just shaking his head and was just scratching his head. And I said, "What's the matter, Bill? Did you see the game?" He said, "Yes." He said, "Bat, there's no way we can beat Missouri." And the next week at Norman was that famous game that caused Don Farrow to name Owen Stadium the Snake Pit. I remember a game at Stillwater before they had all the new stadium and the new field house there, back I believe in 1944. Washington State came down to play Oklahoma State. And the agronomists, or whatever you call the men who take care of the field and fertilize it and all, had made it a point to fill that football field with manure, I presume. And then on Thursday, the rains came, and that field was a quagmire. I was fortunate enough to be able to stay on my feet all day long, but I certainly felt sorry for the players because they were on the ground most of the time and in that mud and quagmire and manure, which you could smell all over the county. Oklahoma A&M was able to beat them. I remember that game because I had a very fine visit with the faculty member from Washington State. And every time Washington State came into Oklahoma, he accompanied the teams. They played at the University of Oklahoma, and I refereed that game. And he was there, and we had another fine visit. His name was Davis. Happened to be a fraternity brother of mine, a dear old SAE. Incidentally, how many of you gentlemen are representing the former A&M Cow College? How many here?
Amen.
Well,
Several others are just not admitting it.
That's quite a nice crowd. I'm proud of you. Dr. Fisher, it probably would be well if you gentlemen would take a look at your shoes. My olfactory senses indicate maybe there's a little manure in here tonight. Are there anybody from Tulsa University? I know Guy isn't here. He wrote me a letter and said, "Bat, and I found out you were on the program. I had some other important business to tend to." No one here from Tulsa. I was just going to say that Tulsa University will be back in competition again just as soon as they can get Oral Roberts to utter a few prayers in their behalf. Now, are there any here from the University of Oklahoma? Well, that's fine. I congratulate you, gentlemen. I know you're from the land of the free and the home of the brave. All right. Now, I was very fortunate during the career as a football official to be able to work in 3 Sugar Bowl games, 1 Cotton Bowl game, the Shrine East-West game, and then a Delta Bowl game in Memphis, a Raisin Bowl game at Fresno, California. In 1941, I officiated the Missouri and Fordham game at New Orleans. Unfortunately, the rains came and there was water all over the field and all over the country, and Missouri's offense was unable to move. And that score was 2-0 in favor of Fordham. That was the 7 rocks of granite that Fordham had. But I'm confident had there been decent weather, Missouri probably would have been able to outscore them. And then in the following year, I officiated in the Tulsa and Tennessee game at the Sugar Bowl. In that game, there was a controversy. I was working as a field judge, and Glenn Dobbs, the famous football player at Tulsa and later the coach, kicked a record punt of 83 yards. It went over the head of the receiver and then took some crazy bounces, and I was back there with them. And one crazy bounce almost hit the Tennessee receiver, but he jumped back and the ball took another crazy bounce. And of course, as you might know, all of the Tulsa contingent thought that the ball hit him. Tulsa man recovered the ball, and had that been correct, it would have been Tulsa's ball and about a 90-yard gain. But unfortunately, I was in better position than the cameras because they were taken from the 50-yard line. We didn't have the television and the reruns now. And I declared the ball Tennessee's ball. And I got a few cat calls, but that doesn't bother anybody. If you're an official, you either know what to do and how to do it, or you don't. If you don't, then you don't belong in there. In that game, this same Glenn Dobbs threw 11 straight completed passes to Sax Judd, the end, and set a record which has not been eclipsed as yet. Of course, it may be someday, because we all know that records are made to be broken. Then, in 1945, that was in the heyday of Bob Fenimore and all of his escorts. Oklahoma A&M played in the Cotton Bowl game at Dallas against TCU. It was no contest, 44-0. And that was the beginning, of course, of the remarkable career of Oklahoma A&M and Jim Thorpe, and of course, Bob Fenimore, who I considered one of the great backs that ever capered on a gridiron in the United States of America. In 1946, Oklahoma A&M played in the Sugar Bowl against St. Mary's College from California. Bob Fenimore for A&M and a young man named Squirman Herman Wiedemeyer from St. Mary's opposed each other, and in that game, the people there never did sit down in their seats. They were standing all the time, and they never knew what was going to happen next, because it was an outstanding game offensively, and both of these boys, Wiedemeyer and Fenimore, were at their best, and actually it was another sight to see. A&M was able to beat them, I think, about 33-18, but it was a great game, and certainly one that a person would go far to see. Later on, A&M played William and Mary College in Memphis, Tennessee. That was dubbed as the Delta Bowl. William and Mary had a fine fullback named Bill Cloud, and they were able to beat Oklahoma A&M. But I think the primary reason for that of course this is just my curbstone opinion, was because for some reason, I've never learned yet why, Jim Spavital did not play in that game for Oklahoma A&M. He accompanied the team. He was there in Memphis. I saw him, and he suited up, but he did not play. And then, in New Year's Day of 1948, I worked the game between Wichita University, the winner of the Missouri Valley League, and the College of Pacific at Fresno, California. This was called a Raisin Bowl. And the star of that game was a young man named Eddie LeBaron, who was a quarterback for the College of the Pacific, an All-American, although he was a tiny football player. Didn't get into basketball. I remember, of course, one game that I played in while at the University of Tulsa. We went to Stillwater to play 2 games. In those days, they only had one referee. That made it easy. Some way, somehow, the referee called a foul on Oklahoma A&M. And in those days also, the man that was fouled didn't necessarily shoot the foul throw. They selected whichever man they thought would do better. He shot all the fouls if the coach wanted him to. So I was playing guard, but on that team, I was selected to shoot the free throws. I made the goal, and the crowd was booing while I was attempting to throw, and they were booing at the referee because he called a foul. The referee promptly gave me the ball, and I made another one. And the same thing happened. This went on for 7 straight free throws. It's easy to see that while I was a guard, I still would usually outscore my forward. But after the 7th free throw, my old friend Ed Gallagher, who was the athletic director and the famous wrestling coach, came out on the floor. And mind you, this was not in the field house now. This was in the old gymnasium. And he came out and admonished the crowd and told them they were performing a good deed for Tulsa University because they were beating their home team by their actions. And he admonished the crowd to be fair, or he would conclude the game if they made another sound. And from then on, the game went along in good shape, but that was a little too much for A&M to overcome. But it shows you, of course, every time you turn around, you're going to find elements of sportsmanship. And Ed Gallagher, in my notion, is one of the finest gentlemen that you will ever see or ever find, wherever you may go. Now, I remember a game when St. Louis University played at A&M. And that particular year, St. Louis University had a great player named McCauley. And to show you the difference in the times now, I knew Ed Hickey, the St. Louis basketball coach, just like I knew a lot of the coaches throughout the country. And in those days, an official was not crucified from a standpoint of being a criminal before the game started. I never missed going to visit with Henry Iva when I would go to Stillwater to referee a basketball game. I never thought it was a crime to go and say hello to Jim Lookaball or to Bud Wilkinson or wherever I might be. That was part of the enjoyment that we as officials got because we knew that we were meeting and talking with fine people, fine gentlemen. And that was part of the game. These days now, an official must not go close to anybody, which of course is one of the things I say is wrong. Anyway, in this game, St. Louis was able to beat Oklahoma A&M. And in those days, you didn't do that very often. But what I was going to say was that St. Louis was going to play at Tulsa University the next day. Now, I went to Tulsa on the first day, and I talked with Eddie Hickey. And he said, Bat, we're going to ride over there in a bus and come back tonight. Why don't you go with us? So I did. I accompanied the St. Louis team in their bus, and Eddie Hickey's mother lived in Cushing. He had the driver take the whole team to his mother's house. We got off there, and she served us ice cream and cake, and then we went on to Stillwater and played. After the game, I was going to return on the bus to Tulsa and referee the game the next night between St. Louis at Tulsa. Well, when the game was over with at Stillwater, the players went out to the bus, I went out to the bus, and lo and behold, we stayed and waited, and it was probably 30 minutes before the coach came out. And you know the reason? The reason was that he had to go into the office and get on the long-distance phone and call the good father in St. Louis to tell him that they had beaten Oklahoma A&M that night. Those are things that happen, and when I tell you these things, it's things that I know, and I'm not telling you from a standpoint of trying to create any other interest except from a factual standpoint. Maybe they're interesting to you, and maybe they're not. But nevertheless, what I say is what I know, and I'm not here from a standpoint of the personal pronoun I, trying to brag about where I've been or what I've done. I'm merely relating incidents that are factual and things that I thought were interesting and things that I remember. Of course, all of this is a long time ago. You have to know that. I remember the greatest game of basketball that I ever saw. I saw as a referee. And this was the famous game at Stillwater between DePaul University and Oklahoma A&M. Oklahoma A&M had the great Bob Curlin, and DePaul University had the great George Mikan. I talked to Henry Iba before the game, and he said, Bat, it's going to be rough. He said, you didn't mean from a standpoint of being pugilistic. He just said it was going to be a rough and tough game, and he said, I predict that the game will be 2 points difference. Well, the game ended 55 to 53 in favor of DePaul. Later, Oklahoma A&M won the NCAA tournament as the national basketball champions. And DePaul went to the invitational tournament, NIT in New York, and won that tournament. And after that, for charity's sake, A&M and DePaul played another game, and Oklahoma A&M was able to beat them. But the thing about this basketball game, when the game was over with, we two officials had to go through the crowd and climb about a half section of steps to go into our dressing room. And the A&M crowd is coming down then from the balcony. As we got to the top, or the half section, to get to the door of our dressing room, I had the key, and I started to put the key into the door so we could go in and change clothes. And I turned around, and lo and behold, here was the DePaul coach. Mind you, he won the game. He saw me and he shook hands. He said, Chief, he said, you worked a hell of a fine game. I said, thank you. And he turned to the other official, who was only 6'6", and he looked up at him, and he said, as for you, you don't have a gut in your body. And that's one of the mysteries of life. I can't understand how any coach, having won, would make it a point to go out of his way and battle that crowd. These are things I haven't told anybody. But these are things that happen, and I know. And even with my patience of Job, had he told me that, I'm afraid I would have knocked his butt down those steps. But this big man stood there, and he started to shake, and I could see that he didn't know what to do. So I grabbed him, and I pushed him through the door and closed it, and that was the end of that incident. But to this day, I've never been able to understand why a coach would go to that extent to declare himself and, of course, show the kind of person that he happened to be. Now, I remember another basketball game that was played here in Oklahoma City in the all-college tournament. You know, I started in basketball refereeing when I was playing at Tulsa University. I remember starting out, I was paid $2.50 to work 3 ball games. Well, back in those days, $2.50 could buy you many a bowl of chili at Ike's Chili Parlor in Tulsa, and I needed the money, so I don't mind that. But a lot of times, we as officials here in the state of Oklahoma have done a lot of work and didn't get paid anything but a thank you in trying to promote high school athletics in the state of Oklahoma. I know Bus Haskins, Dick Pendleton, Earl Jones, Spike Leonard, all of us used to come up here and work the high school football playoffs, and we did it because we enjoyed doing it, and we knew we were helping the high school athletes and helping the High School Athletic Association. And we were the beginners as far as getting high school athletic to the plane that it is on now. And of course, as you all know, Oklahoma is recognized nationally for their athletic teams. But in this game at the all-college tournament, it was between Texas Christian University from Fort Worth and Phillips University from Enid, both good old Christian schools. Ab Curtis from Texas University, who I consider the finest official from the state of Texas. We were working that game together. Hub McQuillan was a Texas Christian coach. And just before the game was to start, we looked around, and a man from the Phillips University bench, not a player, not a coach, but in civilian clothes, and he rushed over to where Hub McQuillan was standing on the court and started in talking to him and waving and talking, and finally grabbed him by the coat and shook him. And Ab and I, Ab Curtis, we were standing watching because we didn't know what was going on, but we were going to be sure and find out if it got worse than that. But he did that, grabbed him and shook him and ejaculated, and finally turned and left and went and took his seat over on the Phillips bench. So Ab and I walked over to Hub McQuillan. Hub, what was going on here? What happened? He said, oh, nothing. He said, that's all right. Everything's all right. Well, what happened? He said, well, that man is a faculty representative from Phillips. He came over to congratulate us, but he got all excited and got to talking and finally grabbed me and shook my coat. Said it was great for Christian teams to be playing each other in athletics. It was such a friendly thing. And he said he kept on, and finally he grabbed me and shook me, and he said, God bless you, brother, we're going to beat hell out of you. Now, just one more thing, which will be quick. I told you that it was great, you know, to be able to go and participate in athletics throughout the country and within our state. One thing it does, it gives you an opportunity to meet fine people, fine gentlemen, great Americans. And I can go down the list and name them, but just for a few, I'll give you names like Bud Wilkinson, Henry Iba, Harry Stuhlerer, Wallace Wade, Henry Franca, Dutch Myers, Bear Bryant, D.X. Bible, Biff Jones, Don Farrow, Francis Smith, Gomer Jones, Wade Walker, Alonzo A. Stagg, Fogg Allen, Jim Tatum, Bruce Drake, Sparky Stalkup from Missouri. To me, of course, I'm thankful that I was fortunate enough to be able to participate, to be able to meet people that I have been able to meet, and to be able to be in situations that required not necessarily intelligence or too much skill, but to know that you are out there for a purpose, for a good reason. And the secret of football and basketball officiating is to be out there and take command and let them know that you are in charge. And this is one of the things about officiating. As I said a while ago, times have changed. Now, there's a lot of difference because the officials don't have that camaraderie that we had with the great men who were coaches or who were athletic directors, because they're prohibited under the NCAA and all of this business now. Why, the officials are practically ostracized, and it more or less puts a stain or a blot on them because you don't have the good times, the good fellowship, the good friendship with the people, of course, that you're working with. And as far as I'm concerned, of course, that is wrong. And gentlemen, with that, I would say, Lord God of hosts, be with us yet, lest we forget, lest we forget. Thank you.